Wrestling by the master physical culturist Billy Sandow and Ed the Strangler Lewis, world heavyweight champion wrestler. Originally published in 1926. The history of wrestling is so closely interwoven with the history of men and nations, and the antiquity of the sport so readily proved in the records of every ancient civilization, that it may be safely assumed that even in prehistoric times, when man's living problems were largely identical with those of the beasts of the jungle, wrestling, in some crude form at least, had begun to take its place as the most fascinating of sports. It so closely approached the daily struggle of life, as life went in the faint dawn of human existence, as to have logically been the earliest variety of sport in which men engaged. Surviving and being steadily improved upon throughout the ages, we find record of the high regard in which the sport was held by the ancient Egyptians, in the many carvings of wrestlers upon the tombs of the pharaohs. Of later origin, though still in remote antiquity, other records are found of wrestling as a favourite sport among the athletes of classic Greece and of the Roman Empire. All literature through the ages is crowded with tales of the prowess of vanished heroes of the grappling arts. So long ago as 1443, a book narrating wrestling methods was published and included illustrations of various wrestling positions. This book, written by one Talhofer, discusses the art of wrestling as it was known to medieval Germany, and the illustrations include and describe positions known as the beginning with equal arm grip, warding off, hip wrestler, arm lock around the hip, the throw over the head, etc. The last mention being the forerunner of the present-day flying mare. Referring again to ancient Rome, we discover wrestling to have been identified with not only the physical life of the empire, but with the intellectual life as well. Such a writer as Quintilian, for example, uses many comparisons to the art of wrestling in his discussion of institutes of eloquence, showing himself as typical of the Roman aristocrats, to have been familiar from experience with the various positions and science of wrestling. Henry de Guy, the Scard, of the medieval line of the Dukes de Guy, is reported to have been a noted wrestler. Mem de Gretz having said of him, tall, thin, robust, eloquent, admirably built for bodily exercises, excelling in wrestling, able to cross a river swimming, fully armed and equipped, unrivalled as a fencer, his handsome face, with vivid glance and curling hair, displayed to all the world from eye to ear the glorious scar which he had won the name Guy de Bellefour, the Scarred. Thus the story of wrestling runs through all of history. Introduced among the Greeks of the 18th Olympiad, wrestling was later declared by Plutarch, the immortal Greek philosopher, to be the most artistic and cunning of all games. Sculptures preserved in the British Museum show wrestling to have been known in ancient times, stretching as far back as ancient Nineveh. The wrestling style developed by the athletes of classic Greece and Rome, in which all holds below the waist are barred, survives to this day in Europe, being known as the Greco-Roman style. In Japan, another system of wrestling is known as jiu-jitsu and judo. The American style, that of catch-as-catch-can, eliminating all unnecessary delays in getting holds, is by far the superior of all other styles of wrestling. It is faster and more scientific. All the moves of Greco-Roman wrestling are permitted in catch-as-catch-can wrestling. The American style catch-as-catch-can is, of course, more complex, its very complexity and tremendous variety of holds adding much to the fascination of the sport. Ed Strangler Lewis has been able to defeat all the Greco-Roman champions imported from Europe, proving by his easy defeat of these wrestlers the great superiority of the catch-as-catch-can style, as does also his defeat of the numerous jiu-jitsu style champions. The various holds in wrestling and their development through passing years in themselves make an interesting study, but we shall here attempt to outline the history of but one, the headlock. The exact origin of this hold is lost in antiquity, however. It is certain that it was employed amongst the wrestlers of ancient Egypt, Greece and Rome. The headlock is portrayed in carvings upon the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs of thousands of years ago. It was used by the wrestlers of early Athens, not as a speciality, but as the hold to turn to when in the give and take of a bout. It seemed a certain means of putting an opponent upon a losing defensive. So closely is the headlock identified with the success of champion Ed the Strangler Lewis, as to have become the marker of a new era in wrestling. Acting upon the advice of his manager Billy Sandow, Lewis began to develop and perfect the headlock. He tutored and trained his left arm to lightning swiftness in the securing of this remarkable hold. He set the headlock apart from other holds and gave it a special distinction. It has been shown in the study made by Billy Sandow and champion Lewis of the headlock that this hold corresponded in most respects with the effect produced by a powerful blow upon the point of the jaw. While, of course, no blow is usually struck in applying the headlock, the same dazing effect and the same dulling of the faculties is produced by the headlock, temporarily, and is secured by a knockout punch to the point of the jaw. The headlock acts directly upon the nerve centres at the base of the brain. The degree of force with which it is applied controls its effectiveness in a bout, and it should be obvious that the trained and expert wrestlers from whom Lewis meets in his matches not only are constantly upon their guard against the headlock, but, owing their average great strength and endurance, it is required that to be effective for Lewis he must apply the headlock with unusual force and utmost skill. To train the left arm to be the dominating auxiliary, if not the main contributor to Lewis's general skill, Billy Sandow invented the famous wooden dummy upon which Lewis could practice and perfect the headlock. This appliance, which is constructed in two sections like a giant apple cut in halves, is held apart by specially designed compression springs, made in sets of 4, each set having a different resistance to pressure. The practicing by Ed the Strangler Lewis with the unemotional appliance was and is, for he constantly uses the famous wooden dummy in his training, patient and determined. Literally, Lewis practices with the appliances by the clock. In the beginning, he did not consider that he had much sufficient progress in a single day until his arms, the left encircling, the right exerting leverage, had closed the halves tightly together, with no further creak or protest from the springs. But before beginning his exercises with the famous wooden dummy, he had conditioned and hardened his muscles of chest and arms by preliminary work in kinetic stress exercises, so that they were easily able to bear the pressure placed upon them. In the connection, it is of interest to recall another remark of the Roman Quintilian, with regard to the training of the ancient Roman wrestlers, a remark made in his writing in comparing the training of the memory with the training of the athlete. Like wrestlers and boxers who accustom themselves to carry leaden weights in their hands, though when they fight they make use of their bare fists, it appears from that the ancient athletes recognise the value of training. Other references, in fact, are made to diet and exercise by the same writer, and the carrying of the leaden weights was to induce a feeling of lightness and quickness in the muscles when the weights had been discarded to engage in a contest. In modern times, wrestling had been advanced to new heights in scientific methods, and it has increased in popularity by leaps and bounds. Today, as the most exciting test of athletic ability and strength, it is the pastime of thousands who actively engage in a sport as amateurs and as professionals, and it has obtained so strong a grip upon public interest that its leading exponents are world celebrities. Wrestling and How to Train by Frank Gotch, Champion of the World. Introduction by Kirk Lawson. Frank Gotch is perhaps the most famous and controversial catch-can wrestler of all time. Born in 1877, Gotch began amateur wrestling as a teenager, where he developed a reputation as an excellent athlete. It was here, in his wrestling formative years, that he acquired his taste and notoriety for using toe holds. Gotch began his professional wrestling career in 1899 against none other than former American heavyweight champion Dan McLeod. Though he lost, it was only after a 2-hour battle, an impressive feat by a newcomer against a champion. Later that same year, Gotch challenged and again lost to champion and wrestling legend Martin Farmer Burns, who was so impressed that he offered to coach Gotch. Gotch eventually took the title of American heavyweight champion in 1904 in a match against Tom Jenkins. Undoubtedly, Gotch's most famous matches and the source of much of the controversy were his matches against wrestling great George Hackenschmidt for the title of World Heavyweight Champion. Gotch won the title in 1908 with one of his signature toe holds and then defended it against Hackenschmidt in 1911. In both of these matches, Hackenschmidt and fans claimed foul by Gotch. However, nothing more than scandalous rumours ever came of the accusations. Retiring in 1913, Gotch held 3 wrestling titles in his career: Champion of the Klondike, American Heavyweight and World Heavyweight, and has been inducted into at least 3 Wrestling Hall of Fames. This book, published in 1908 at the height of his career, documents and purports to teach catch-can wrestling of the time. This manual is truly a slice of grappling history. Introduction by Horace Lurch. In winning the World's Wrestling Championship from George Hackenschmidt, the Russian Lion, in the bout decided in Chicago on April 3rd, 1908, Frank Gotch, the young American grappler, attained the highest pinnacle of fame in this branch of professional sport, and, hard as his tasks have been in the rough battle to the top, it is quite likely that he will find even a more difficult time of it after the first blush of triumph has passed and title matches will succeed the earlier and easier emoluments of a championship. But Gotch should be well qualified to undertake the work which will confront him, and we can have every confidence in his future. He is young, strong, ambitious, has fought his way to popularity, has come to the front in the face of disasters which would have nipped in the bud the career of a less determined fellow. And we must remember that good judges among the veteran students of the sport of wrestling declare Gotch the best man who ever stood at the head of the American mat, outclosing in strength, endurance and style combined. Even such great stars of other days as Joe Acton, Edwin Bibby, Clarence Whistler, Strangler Lewis, Jack Carkeek, Farmer Burns, Dan McLeod, Tom Jenkins, and other men whose names have echoed in the Hall of Sporting Fame. Scarcely past 30 years of age, Gotch, granted that he has already accomplished much, would appear to have a brilliant career yet in store. 10 years ago, few would have linked his name with championship wrestling. Still, he was a sturdy youngster in those days, and it is now an old story how Dan McLeod, then in his prime, found the green country boy a bad customer when, under an alias, the veteran Scot was touring the country. McLeod defeated Gotch then, but his knowledge of wrestling and wrestlers led him to predict the glowing prospects for the then boy, if he did not abandon his mat exercises. Gotch did not abandon it. Farmer Burns came along. He had a rough match with Frank and annexed him as a partner. Much of his present ability Gotch acquired during his association with the farmer, and today he is as proud to say so as Burns is to have him state the fact. Then followed the trip to the Klondike and a series of victories in the Gold Country, the greatest being the one full match for a side bet of $10,000, which Gotch won in a quarter of an hour, dethroning the Swedish champion of Dawson City and breaking the backers of the foreigners. Before his departure to Alaska, Gotch had had a try with Jenkins in Cleveland, and although holding the then American champion on his feet for more than 2 hours, he finally lost the match. On his return to the Pacific coast from the frozen north, Gotch again tilted with Jenkins and won from him in Whatcom Wash. A few months later, he repeated the defeat in Jenkins' hometown of Cleveland, and few believed the Forest City rolling mill man had any chance to regain his laurels lost to the lusty youngster from the West. Hackenschmidt was then on his way from Australia to make his first visit to America, and a match with the champion of this country was in prospect. New York was clamouring for a sight of its new wrestling champion, the challenger of Jeffries for the prize ring crown, and Gotch consented to still another match with Jenkins in the metropolis. Gotch had always said that he beat me and made me like it in the old days, but the more I beat them now, the less they seem to like it. A quick illness seized Gotch on the eve of his match with Jenkins in New York. He went on the mat far from a well man, hoping for the best but lost. Hackenschmidt, who had previously won from Jenkins in London, arrived in New York, made a catch-as-catch-can match, and again won from Tom, then turned a deaf ear to Gotch's challenge, and treated him with contempt. After the Lions' return home in May of 1905, Gotch again met Jenkins in New York. Preparation for 3 successive matches had put the old warhorse in splendid physical trim. Gotch, not yet returned to his finest form, engaged in what proved to be a terrific battle, long to be remembered by metropolitan sporting enthusiasts, Jenkins winning the third and deciding fall only after nearly 3 hours of continuous wrestling, the match lasting until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning in Madison Square Garden. The double defeat at the hands of the man from whom he had wrested the championship fairly staggered Gotch, but events proved that he was but temporarily stunned, and that his indomitable courage could not be subdued. With his reputation to be carved anew, he started in the autumn of 1905, what resulted in a whirlwind match campaign, which carried him to all sections of the continent, a campaign which for numbers of miles travelled and opponents defeated will scarcely ever be duplicated. This grand tour culminated in May of 1906 in Kansas City, when Gotch again won back the American Championship from Jenkins in a 2 falls out of 3 match. In the Chicago match with George Hackenschmidt, Gotch was magnificently trained and seconded by those 2 great veterans, Farmer Burns, who was responsible for his early development, and Jack Carkeek, who toured England as a champion at the time of Hackenschmidt's advent, and whose intimate knowledge of the methods and the character of the big fellow made him an invaluable ally. With these 2 men, Gotch planned a victory which was admirably executed. He had often said, "If I meet Hackenschmidt, it may last a minute, it may last an hour, but defeat or victory, short or long, it will be a contest." And it was a contest of more than 2 hours, a contest which spelled victory for the American every minute after the first 15 had witnessed the burly champion's strength sapped in futile attack. Hackenschmidt was stopped, threatened, completely routed, and incidentally, it took some man to still the lion. The victory was the crowning triumph to a remarkable athletic career. Gotch, a man of intelligence as well as strength, had amassed considerable wealth as a result of his physical exertions. His land, rich in Iowa, his native state, has plenty of ready cash and possesses other valuable interests. Hints on Training by Frank Gotch. In view of the fact that wrestling calls for endurance and strength, as well as wind, those are the three things the amateur must cultivate from the beginning. With this object in view, however, he must not overlook the question of speed, which is an essential to the man on the mat as it is to the boxer in the ring. Taken all in all, there is nothing that will so develop a man's muscles and make him strong in mind and body as wrestling. A young man would be very foolish to start in at once without any preliminary preparation on a rigorous course of training. He must season himself gradually by gymnastic work of a light character, increasing his task as he feels he is getting better and stronger. And he should not attempt any serious wrestling until his muscles are well enough developed to withstand the unusual and severe strain which will be put upon them. As a pleasing and interesting diversion, he can practice holds and counters with some friends, learn the quarter, half and full Nelsons, the hammerlock, the hip lock and the scissors. How long it will take any certain person to get into what is known as good condition will depend entirely upon their constitution and their ability to work. One man might condition himself in a month, where it would take another at least 3 months to get in this kind of shape. For the wind, and this must not be overlooked, take a course of running, on country roads where it is possible, where it is not, then run anywhere. A half-mile will do, if you haven't been used to it. The student himself will be the best judge of that. But don't cover so great a distance that you are fatigued out at the finish. Work gradually into a longer easy stride and keep it up. On to return to a good rub down with a coarse towel, followed by a cold plunge or a cold sponge bath, will be found very invigorating. Bear in mind that the object to be obtained is the hardening of no one set of muscles, but of all the muscles in the entire body, as well as the heart and lungs. Bear in mind that wrestling in itself is the greatest of all athletic exercises. Cut out all kinds of tobacco and liquors from the start, and forget that they ever existed if you want to amount to anything physically. Great athletes may have been great drinkers in their day, but they could have been greater, and their powers and endurance would have been more lasting if they had been total abstainers. When you feel that you've reached the stage where you can stand 15 minutes of hard work, get a wrestling partner. In a friendly bout, you need not be particular about the weight, and if possible, get someone who knows more about the game than you do, and you'll be able to learn from him. Don't expect to be told everything, but use your eyes as well as your brains. Study out the different situations and try to figure out in advance what your opponent intends to do. In that way, you'll be ready to block them. In beating Hackenschmidt, the world's champion, I had him all figured out in advance, and I knew what moves he intended to make, in many cases, before he put them into execution, and, if he had not quit, I would have turned him on his back, just as I knew I would when we shook hands at the beginning of the hostilities. Study out the counters for the different holds, and always be prepared to squeeze out of a tight corner when the occasion rises. In applying the toe hold, do so with the utmost care, in order that you may not seriously maim your opponent. You will appreciate how effective it is if properly done. A book of this size, on so important a sport as wrestling, must necessarily be incomplete to a certain extent, so if there is anything between these covers concerning which you are in doubt, I'll be glad to answer any questions you may ask in the columns of the Police Gazette, if you will send your query to me, care of that office. But above all things, don't expect to become a proficient wrestler without going through a series of preliminary training and exercises, which is a common failing amongst amateurs. Get strong gradually, bearing in mind that great speed is always a necessary adjunct to everything in the athletic line. Never lose your temper for an instant. Keep cool always, and study every move of your opponent, and if possible, try to anticipate what he intends doing. That is half of the game. The other half is to try and deceive him as to your next movement. The Science of Wrestling by Frank Gotch. In the wrestling struggles of long ago, when the sport had its real modern beginning, the ordinary attire was worn, but nowadays the wrestlers divest themselves of anything in the way of superfluous weight or what is calculated to interfere with the perfect freedom of their movements. The ancient Greeks and Romans, for instance, wrestled in a state of complete nudity, or with a strip of cloth around their loins. Modern wrestlers wear skin tights on their lower limbs with arms and torsos bare. In Turkey, however, leather drawers are the rule, and the grip may be put upon them. In Switzerland, the drawers or the belt may be grasped in order to secure a hold. Then, in the earlier Grecian and Roman contests, the bodies and limbs of the wrestlers were plentifully anointed with oil and grease, the object of this undoubtedly being to prevent a hold being secured by an opponent. Our modern articles of agreement, however, state explicitly that no oil or grease shall be used, and as a set-off to the method pursued by the ancients, who rubbed their hands on the sand in the arena, wrestlers of today are debarred from using resin, drugs, or any prescription in order to increase the tenacity of their hold. Again, brutality is sternly repressed today. Practically any hold or method of procedure was allowed in the days of old. Men might strangle, gouge, or snap the limbs of an adversary, provided they had an opportunity of doing so. But in a modern match, the stranglehold is not allowed as a rule, neither is the full Nelson or the hang, and many referees even refuse to allow the arm across the mouth, although it is occasionally brought into use when the contest is under purely Lancashire rules. No matter what may be said, there is absolutely no brutality attached to modern day wrestling. Men are competed today who were before the public 20 years ago, and a man may remain very the head of his possessions until he reaches 50 years of age. Jack Carkeek, for instance, is 42, Joe Carroll is 34, and Tom Jenkins is 32. These are but three, and although it cannot be denied that a wrestler has reached his prime at 40, the fact still remains that skill and experience go far to balance a handicap in the matter of years. And now, just a brief explanation concerning the various styles. Taking Greek and Roman first, no tripping is allowed. Every hold must be above the waist, and the strangle is fought out upon the mat. This is not edifying, but the contest terminates when both shoulders are pressed down. Wrestlers in the Cornwall and Devon style compete in strongly made jackets, all holds being above the waist, or on any portion of the jacket. Kicking is now declared to be a foul, but tripping is allowed, and a man is beaten when his two shoulders and one hip, two hips and one shoulder, or both shoulders, before any other portion of the body touch the ground, and then the fall is gained. Under the Cumberland and Westmoreland system, the men stand chest pressed against chest, and chin on the opponent's shoulder. The grasp is around the body, one arm under, and the other over the shoulder, each man joining his hands behind his opponent. Kicking is again forbidden, and if both fall together, the bout is recommenced. When one goes down before the other, then the fall is gained. In Ireland, the style is termed collar and elbow, the wrestlers gripping the elbow of one hand and the collar with the other. Neither must loosen his hold until the fall is gained, victory remaining with the man who may be able to retain his feet. In Scotland, the style is a hybrid one, 2 points or both shoulders being down and the fall then gained. Catch as catch can, however, is without a doubt the favourite style at the present time, and despite the fact that some groundwork is absolutely unavoidable, every bout is bright and interesting from beginning to end. Any hold is allowed except those previously mentioned, the full Nelson and the hand together with the stranglehold and the hammerlock where amateurs are concerned, the legwork being an especially strong feature where the champions are concerned. The good wrestler is as supple and as light as a ballet dancer, and there is little advantage to be gained in going to the mat and allowing an opponent to work above you. Brute strength is not so much a necessity as in Greek and Roman wrestling. Clarity of movement is the life and soul of catch as catch can. A quick twist, and the expert has a grip on his man that he cannot escape from. The story of David and Goliath may be repeated. A little fellow, a born wrestler, will beat a bigger but clumsier man every time. The English wrestlers are, as a rule, found at their best in the ranks of the 12 stone and 13 stone men. The suggestion has been made in this country it would be a good idea to bar wrestlers from meeting boxers on the mat, but it is a difficult matter to see just how this will be done. Many fake bouts have been held between fighters and wrestlers, and rarely is one on the level. The grapplers, realising that they could make some money by meeting fighters of reputation on the mat, consented to deals that would not be contested in a contest between two wrestlers. There are very few fighters in the ring who are capable of holding their own on the carpet with experienced and well-seasoned wrestlers. It is true that a pugilist makes wrestling a part of his daily training stunts. It is a fine exercise and helps to strengthen and develop muscles that aid him in his fights, but few of them become adept at this game, just as there are very few wrestlers who make excellent scrappers. When a fighter and a wrestler agree to a match on the mat, the affair is sure to be a handicapped one. That is, the wrestler undertakes to throw the fighter so many times in an hour. Usually it is 3 times. If the wrestler fails in his task, he has a ready excuse, and if the fighter is thrown, his reputation in the least does not suffer. He will that, it is not his forte in all of that. The public who go to see such contests are, as a rule, victimised. They do not see the genuine article, because if the wrestler, unless he is of a very inferior one, utilised all of his skill and was out to win in a hurry, would not have much trouble in putting his rival down in such a quick time that the match would resolve itself into the worst kind of farce. A certain pugilist who has pretensions as a wrestler will not go on with a match with a wrestler unless he is assured that his opponent will not handle him roughly and will not throw him until a certain time. In this way, he has been able to build up a reputation as a wrestler that does not belong to him. His followers, who are not acquainted with the inside workings of the game, have come to look upon him as a wonderful mat artist, and consequently, when he appears, he is greeted by large crowds. Such matches are certain to hurt wrestling in the long run. Handicap matches, anyway, leave a wrong impression, and in the opinion of many, they should be frowned upon. To many folks, they are worse than the exhibition bouts at the local theatres. These contests are usually for 15 minutes. A lot of head spinning and unnecessary gyrations are indulged in, and with the result that the outcome is a draw. Sometimes a man is thrown before the limit is reached. In 9 times out of 10, the affairs are rehearsed beforehand, because the monetary consideration is so small that the star grappler cannot afford to take any chances of injuring his reputation by being flopped himself. Wrestling by Percy Longhurst. Originally published in 1938. Why wrestling ought to be encouraged. Very far removed from the actual fact is the generally prevailing impression that wrestling as a sport or as an exercise is suitable only for those of great weight, unusual strength, and over-average muscular development. Most desirable is it that I should emphasize that success in this art is not at all dependent upon the possession of these physical qualities. Desirable because there is now taking place a strong movement encouraged by the Board of Education towards the inclusion of wrestling among those sports and exercises fit for practice by boys of school age. To myself, with more than 40 years' experience of wrestling, as a participant and honorary instructor, as a referee and official of the amateur governing body of the sport, the National Amateur Wrestling Association, by whose effort alone the art has been prevented from dying out in this country. Although wrestling, like running or jumping, is essentially a natural athletic exercise and pastime, some skilled guidance is desirable unless one wishes to be no better than a rough and tumble performer. Expert instruction enables the novice to avoid the many pitfalls that inevitably await the self-taught, to gain that knowledge of the wrestling art wherewith he will be able to demonstrate the superiority of agility, quickness, and trained knowledge over untutored muscular power, and to reduce by an appreciable extent the period necessary to become a competent and successful exponent. With a clear recollection of his own difficulties as a novice, this author has attempted to present the instructions in such a manner and by such stages of progression as should tend, given the reader's serious cooperation, to obtain that end with the least possible delay and expenditure of energy. Recognition of the value of wrestling, however belated it may be, is peculiarly gratifying. From the earliest periods of history, wrestling has been a popular recreation, a sport in which the English had the reputation of being particularly skillful. Whoever has read the Canterbury Tales will not forget the two references to wrestling: Gamelin in the Cook's Tale, a pre-Corsarian poem often printed in Chaucer's work, and the redoubtable Miller who, at wrestling, would bear away the ram. To Agincourt, Cornwall sent 500 fighting men, who marched under a banner bearing the figures of two wrestlers in holds. When Henry VIII journeyed to the field of the Cloth of Gold, he sent to Cornwall for 6 or 8 tried wrestlers, to match against the best France could produce. And the Cornishmen won. We shall see why. In the early 18th century, Sir Thomas Parkins of Bunny, Nottinghamshire, himself a mighty wrestler, wrote the first English textbook on the subject. Richard Trevithick, inventor of the high-pressure engine, was a remarkable exponent of the art. Until well into the middle of the 19th century, wrestling maintained its popularity, especially in the western and northern western counties, each of these localities having its distinctive styles. Then came a decline, and the reason is not far to seek. For the utmost expertness in the sport, early training rightly was considered essential. Hence, the superiority of the wrestlers of Cornwall and of Cumberland and Westmoreland, for in these parts it was, until comparatively recently, the common thing for schoolboys to gather on the village green, pitch in their hats, the form of challenge, throw off their jackets and get go. Says Carew, who wrote in his survey of Cornwall in 1602, "You shall hardly find an assembly of boys in Devon and Cornwall where the most untowardly amongst them will not as readily give you a muster, a trial, of this exercise as you are prone to require it." Much the same obtained in the northern counties. The point I am anxious to drive home is that wrestling is as much a boy's exercise as it is a man's. It is as perfectly suitable to his physical powers as it is to fulfilment of his preference for doing something more interesting than calisthenics or jerks. There are good people who, for want of knowing better, regard the sport as a dangerous one. Well, its exponents will collect a few bruises maybe, but nothing much worse. It is a developmental exercise, one that exercises every bit of the body equally, if strenuously. There can be no one-sided or unequal development with those who practice wrestling frequently, which is not to be said of all athletic games and sports. It imposes no prolonged severe strains upon either the muscles or the skeleton, the heart or the lungs. True, there are moments in a wrestling bout when every ounce of power and atom of energy may be called into action, but such moments are of brief duration. From the point of view of comparative international excellence, this country of ours has to admit inferiority. Not since 1908, when the Olympic Games took place in London, has a British wrestler won an Olympic gold medal. I will not say this is due to any physical inferiority of our representatives. Our island can produce men the physical equals of the wrestlers of any other country. We have fallen behind perhaps because of a certain slackness, of a lack of the intensive methods of training followed abroad. It is to the rising generation we must look if we are to regain, at least, equality with our foreign rivals. And if the movement previously referred to can be conducted with enthusiasm, the youth of the country will suitably respond. There can be no doubt. I am convinced that equality and something beyond will be a consequence. What is more, our youngsters will be better grown, better developed, more enduring, fitter and healthier, better adapted to become, a few years later, men of a A1 physical rating. I'm not suggesting that wrestling is an enchanter's wand whereby the ill-informed, the weak and the sickly can be transformed into young gamelins, but I do assert, with a confidence found upon my experience, that in the exercise lies the essence of one of the most valuable forms of physical training and development. That its value is now receiving recognition is a matter of real thankfulness to those enthusiasts whose belief that such recognition would come is now receiving such justification. It is superfluous to attempt an explanation of the many and varying styles of wrestling which have developed from the barbaric, rough-and-tumble contests of primitive days. I will pass by the Glima of Iceland, the Schwingen of Switzerland, ignore even the Greco-Roman of so-called classic style, which it is not, favourite amongst the wrestlers of the European continent. I must pass over, though, regretfully, so many are its fine points, the West Country, Cornish or Celtic style, now undergoing a revival, with the exception of the Greco-Roman, which is a catcher's catch-can, minus all offensive and defensive work with the legs, and with all holds taken above the hip. The purely national style requires the use of certain extraneous material, belts, straps and so forth, much as the Cornish style demands the wearing of a loose jacket by which all holds are taken. I propose to deal with the Cumberland and Westmoreland and the catch-can styles, together with a third of very recent origin, the character of which is such as to make it particularly suitable for young wrestlers, the standing catch-can, as its originator, Mr. S.V. Bacon, has named it. Wrestling in these three styles may be both an indoor and outdoor pastime, suitable therefore for both summer and winter, but Mr. Bacon's system owns an advantage possessed by neither of its others. Even if practiced indoors, no mat is required. Indeed, it is immaterial whether the wrestling ground be grass, a wooden floor, sand, gravel, or even concrete. Any piece of good turf of a few yards square will serve for the Cumberland and Westmoreland style, but if it be bought under a roof, a mat of some kind is necessary. This too applies to the ordinary catch-can, which may be termed the universal style, since it has devotees in every quarter of the earth. If practiced outdoors, a mat of some kind is highly desirable, as so much of the action takes the form of ground wrestling. It is Mr. Bacon's style which most certainly will be adopted as part of school physical training, for the good reason that a mat is not necessary. Wrestling mats of any type are expensive. One would be fortunate to be able to purchase a mat of suitable size, say 16 feet each way, for anything less than £25. Such a mat, although made in 4 parts joined by straps and buckles along the inner edges, is heavy and difficult to move about. Also, it needs a fair extent of space for storage. Moreover, so lively are the movements during a wrestling bout that a mat of this size, referred to above, will be monopolised by the couple engaged. The advantage of a system of wrestling which carries with it none of these drawbacks will be too obvious to require emphasis. They become even more notable in their relation to school instruction in wrestling. Already a number of schools have adopted wrestling as a form of physical training, and in all of these it is a standing catch-can which has been selected. Standing catch-can requires no mat because it does away with the fall, since a wrestling bout in every other known style is a close struggle between the two opposing parties as to which shall succeed in upsetting his opponent or placing him on the ground in a certain position. It may well be asked how this new style can be deservedly termed wrestling if the normal aim and purpose of the contest be removed. The answer is as simple as it is adequate. In standing catchers can, a clean lift, both feet off the ground, takes the place of the throw, and since there is no throwing, there is no need for a mat. True, no throwing means no tripping, and the art of tripping an opponent is a highly developed one. It is most important feature of the Cumberland and Westmoreland and the Cornish styles. Perhaps its highest stage of development is displayed in judo, the Japanese athletic exercise, which is a deadly system of self-defense, but may be modified to nothing more than a friendly contest. Mr. Bacon, an expert wrestler in both the catchers can and Cumberland and Westmoreland styles, winner of numerous amateur championships under both codes, does not assert the standing catch can is a perfect style of wrestling, or that it is intended to supplement the older styles. It is based upon holds and moves common to each of them, and he devised it particularly for the use of scouts and other youths who have hitherto been disbarred from the practice and enjoyment of all forms of wrestling because the essential mats, for this given reason, have not been at their disposal. To suppose that the exclusion of the throw and its substitution by a lift is destructive of all that makes a wrestling bout worthwhile, either as a pastime or as a form of physical training, would be quite inaccurate. I have taught the system both in and out of doors, on grass and on wooden floor, and my experience that boys like it and take to it as a duck to water is corroborated by every instructor I've ever met. Standing catch-can is pure wrestling. It affords scope for the exercise of strength, agility, dexterity and staying power. It may be played anywhere, and the outlay demanded is nil. And it affords a valuable preparation for the mastery of the essential points of the older systems.